part 2 of Act 5 of Macbeth. So we're looking at scenes 5 all the way to the end. And you remember in the previous scene, we were in the countryside at Birnam Wood. We had quite a few thanes there. We had Malcolm, we had Siward, we had Macduff, young Siward. And Malcolm gave instruction to all the troops that they grab a branch of Birnam Wood and they hold it in front of them so that it would hide the number of soldiers there were, so that Macbeth would receive inaccurate reports from his messengers. And the scene ends with Siward saying, well, there's no point in standing around here. The only way we're going to solve this is through violence and war. And so they start marching on towards Macbeth's castle in Dunsinane, but they're about 3 to 4 miles out, so Macbeth can't actually see them yet. And he knows that they're coming, but he certainly doesn't know that they are holding branches and things like that. Alright, so scene 5 begins inside Macbeth's castle, and Macbeth announces that they must hang out all the flags on the outer walls. He's pretty confident at this point. He wants to show the English forces that he's not afraid. He says that our castle is strong enough to defend any number of troops. In fact, that they can all just die out of hunger and disease out there for all he cares. He then says, well, if it wasn't for many of his soldiers leaving, running away and revolting and joining the English forces, he'd actually be able to meet these English forces outside his castle and beat them up pretty much and destroy them, send them back to England. Then we hear a noise off stage of a woman cry, and Macbeth wants to know what it is, and Satan goes to go and find out. And while he's gone, Macbeth has a little aside, or a soliloquy as we call it, and he says that he's also almost forgotten the taste of fear. He doesn't even know what it's like to be scared anymore. You know, there was a time when if he had heard a funny noise in the night, it would have terrified him. But because he's done so many horrific things in his life recently, he's become numb to the horrors of the world and horrible things like that, because it's so familiar to him, it doesn't even startle him anymore. And Satan arrives and says, my lord, the queen is dead, expecting Macbeth to really crumble at this news. But in actual fact, Macbeth coldly replies with, well, you know what, she would have died at some stage anyway, it was bound to happen. Now we can compare that to how Macduff reacts when he hears the news of his wife and his children's murder, versus now, as you can see, the cold-heartedness of Macbeth upon hearing that his wife, the queen, has been killed. And he almost just pushes it aside. And then he gives this whole speech of pessimism and despair, which is no surprise at this point in the play, really. And it starts off with a very well-known piece of text from the play, Out, Out, Brief Candle. There is a poem called Out, Out, which has got nothing to do with Macbeth. It's just about a boy cutting his hand off in a buzzsaw. But it is believed that the title is inspired by this section of Macbeth, a very well-known piece for a reason, and I'm going to explain that now. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow. In other words, life's just an illusion. It's like a poor actor who struts and worries for his hour on the stage, then is never heard from again. Life is a story told by an idiot, full of noise and emotional disturbance, but devoid of meaning. So now, if we look at that passage, we could say, okay, here we are put on this earth for a short period of time, and really is a short period of time, relevant to how old the earth is and how many number of people have come and gone before us and things like that. So let's call the earth a stage, and let's say we've got an hour on this stage. And while we're experiencing our hour, we strut and fret. In other words, we try and make a name for ourselves, we try and achieve things, we try and do things, experience things, but once we die, we're heard of no more. That's it. It's almost like we're trying to tell this story as if it's the only time that the world has ever existed, kind of thing, when in actual fact we're just one but so many actors on this stage, and once we die, that's it. Our lives are over and people just carry on with their lives. So Macbeth is saying life is meaningless. But now if we analyze that, if he says that life is meaningless, that means that everything is meaningless, right? Therefore Macbeth's crimes are meaningless too, because they signify nothing, which makes the evil deeds that he's done less awful as well. So it's almost like he's validating or trying to provide a reason for, why everything that he's done is not actually that bad, because nothing matters, life is meaningless. And there he is, he's looking at his wife's body. And here is the Queen of Scotland lying there dead. And Macbeth does in fact just move on with his life straight away, and so does everybody else, because the Queen is actually just left lying there, because nobody has any respect for the King and Queen of Scotland at all. So this Queen, who's supposedly so powerful and so well respected, is clearly not, to the extent that her body is just left there. Alright, and then at this point a messenger tells Macbeth, listen, I've got some news, but I don't know how to tell you. Macbeth says, well, you better tell me. And he says, well, it looks like Birnam Wood is actually moving towards your castle. And Macbeth recognizes this as an apparition and gets immediately very angry and accuses the messenger of being a liar and a slave. But the messenger assures him that no, he's telling the truth. And Macbeth says, if thou speakst false, upon the next tree shalt thou hang alive. In other words, if you're lying to me, I'll hang you from the nearest tree until you die of hunger. And this screenshot here is really Macbeth seeing this forest supposedly moving right towards his castle, and realizing that, you know what, maybe the witches have tricked me. Maybe they've lied to me. Maybe they've told me double truths, because this whole Birnam Wood march into Dunsinane is actually happening. So this is the first apparition that is coming true in the sense of literal truth, and not equivocation truth. And so despite that, he rings the alarm bell, he calls for the bells to be rung, and he says, well, I must prepare for battle. If what this messenger says is true, it's no use running away or staying here. I'm starting to grow tired of living. I'd like to see the world plunge into chaos. He then says, well, at least we'll die with our armor on. So it could be that he's recognizing that, this could be the end for him. He could be dying soon. But he's not about to give up, though. He's certainly not about to kill himself either, because he says at the start of scene 8 that why should I commit suicide like one of those ancient Romans? As long as I see enemies of mine alive, I'd rather see my sword wound them than me. So he's still got that fight in him, he's still got that desire, and he's still going to hold on to those other two apparitions that the witches gave him. Discuss that. Right, Act 5, Scene 6, very short little scene. Basically all it is the troops have now arrived at Macbeth's castle, and Malcolm says, you guys can all drop your branches now, there's no need to hide how many there are of us. And he says, Siward and young Siward, you will lead the first battle, and me and Macduff, Macduff and I will follow behind you. So they agree to that. And now, scene 7, we see young Siward, very courageous, very brave, trying to prove himself, really hungry for Macbeth's blood. He really wants to prove himself by killing this tyrant, this king. All right. And Macbeth sees him and says, listen, you should be terrified by my name. And young Siward says, no, I'm not terrified, even if you were one of the worst demons in hell. And they fight, and unfortunately Macbeth does in fact kill young Siward. He says, thou wast born of woman. In other words, no wonder you couldn't beat me, because obviously you're born of woman. So he's holding on to that apparition, that no man born of woman can harm Macbeth. And then he goes out and he says, look, I'm looking for somebody who is not of woman born, because if there isn't anybody, then I've got no one to be afraid of. Notice as well that there's like no soldiers really on Macbeth's side here. They've all run away. All right, they don't want to fight for him anyway. And Macduff is now looking for Macbeth because he wants to kill Macbeth, obviously because Macbeth had his whole family murdered. He actually says, if someone other than me kills you, Macbeth, the ghosts of my wife and children will haunt me forever. And Macduff says to Macbeth, well, turn around, hellhound. And Macbeth says, look, I've actually had enough blood on my hands with your family already. I've actually killed your wife and your kids. I have no desire to kill you. And then Macduff announces, I was actually from my mother's womb untimely ripped. Now, it's a bit of a stretch, of course. It is just a play, but what that means is that he was born by cesarean section untimely. In other words, it wasn't natural birth. He was delivered, in a sense, before he should have been. So it's an untimely ripped out of his mother's womb, which makes that apparition true in the sense that he wasn't born of woman, as it were. And Macbeth says, well, curse you for telling me this. You've frightened away my courage. And he realizes that he doesn't actually believe the witches anymore. He says that they've tricked him with their games and their equivocation. They've given me hope, and now they've destroyed me. He says, I won't fight you. But then he says, well, you know what? I'm actually not going to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet. I'm not going to surrender. Even though Birnam Wood really did come to Dunsinane, so there's that apparition, and I'm fighting a man not born of woman, so that's the other apparition, I'll fight to the end. So we got to give him a little bit of credit there for being courageous in a sense, and not just standing down. Because Macduff actually said, well, if you don't want to fight me, surrender, you coward. We'll put you in a freak show, just like they do with animals, and we'll put a picture of you on a sign right above the words that says, come see the tyrant. And obviously Macbeth is not going to go down that way. So he decides to fight. And they do fight, and Macduff kills him and cuts his head off. And quite a gruesome scene there, and not bad for 1971. And at that point, there's obviously celebrations because Macbeth, the tyrant has been killed by Macduff, and Malcolm is made the new King of Scotland. The only thing that I want to add there before we finish off is that Siward was a little bit concerned in scene 9 as to where his son was, and I'm not quite sure why he didn't realize yet that his son had been killed. But anyway, Ross says that, he's been carried off the field, he is dead, but you know what, he was stabbed in the front. And Siward makes Siward so happy because he knows that his son wasn't a coward and tried to run away from danger, didn't try to run away from Macbeth. He got stabbed in the front, which means he was fighting Macbeth eye to eye. And so Siward says, well then, he's God's soldier now. If I had as many sons as I have hairs on my head, I couldn't hope that any of them would die more honorable than he did. Okay, so he's proud of his son for dying courageously. Alright, and then the scene ends, and essentially the play ends with Malcolm saying that he's going to name all his thanes and kingsmen earls, the first earls that Scotland has ever had. He says there's a lot to do to try and clean up what Macbeth has done to the country, and his demon-like queen as well, who is rumoured to have committed suicide. So that's where we get the suicide evidence from. And then he says, and whatever else we are called to do by God, we will do at the right time and in the right place. And so, if we think about it, what was King Duncan's fault, really? His fault was he was far too trusting. He was trusting of the Thane of Cawdor, he was trusting of MacDonald, who was a traitor, he was trusting of Macbeth, and it got him killed. Macbeth has also been too trusting in that he's been far too trusting of the witches. No matter what they tell him, he believes. And we also look at the start of the play, we see a traitor, MacDonald, being executed or decapitated by Macbeth because MacDonald was a traitor, and Macbeth, who was this valiant soldier, obviously cut his head off, and that made King Duncan proud. And now we're here at the end of the play, and we see Macduff, who is a brave and rightful soldier, killing Macbeth, who is the traitor, and cutting his head off. So there is a parallel there for sure. And lastly, you think about what is the purpose of this play? What is the message of this play? Well, there's a lot to talk about there. And I think it's no doubt that fate cannot be changed. The Weird Sisters, or the witches, they predicted all these things, and they did in fact come true because they were going to happen. When Duncan was alive, he said that Malcolm was going to be heir to the throne, and Malcolm was made king eventually. And although we're not told, Banquo's sons are supposedly, or his descendants, are going to be king as well. So it's almost like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can't change fate. The other thing is power obviously corrupts people. When people get power, they do stupid things sometimes. They do things that are out of their character or not what they would normally have done. And it goes with greed and it goes with ambition, because Macbeth, remember, had that vaulting ambition which made him do these things to get that power. And the witches, played him because of that, because they knew about the ambition, the amount of ambition that he had. Another point that you could make is that decisions have consequences. If you're going to do something like kill the king, for example, you can't run away from that. It's going to have consequences, and very often consequences have more action which have more consequences. Blood will have blood. If you start killing the king and the next minute you have to kill somebody else and kill somebody else, and it's going to catch up with you eventually. And the last thing that I just want to say is that we make our own choices. So yes, on the one hand, we can argue that fate is, set in stone and cannot be changed in that. But at the same time, we do have free will. We do have the ability to make these decisions. Like Macbeth made many decisions. And as I say, if you're going to make a wrong decision, you must deal with that consequence. Lady Macbeth made decisions to unsex her and to assist, to basically plan the killing of Duncan, and eventually she couldn't handle the guilt anymore, and it led to suicide. So you can't make decisions in isolation or in a vacuum and expect it to just go away. You can't just wash blood off your hands and that's that guilt will remain with you. So I hope that you have enjoyed the play, and I hope that you can appreciate the value that the play has and how cleverly it's actually been written and done. It's a fantastic play. It holds a lot of themes. Appearance versus reality is certainly one of them. But there's so much to read about, and there's so much to think about as well. If you don't just rely on outside sources for information, allow yourself to think about the plot, the narrative, the characters, and how it started and how it ended. And we can make a comparison between King Duncan and Malcolm and even King Edward, the King of England. We can make comparisons between Banquo and Macbeth. The most well-known comparison that we can do is between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and certainly how they each take on a role at the start of the play and how those roles are seemingly reversed as the play progresses. So that's it, guys. That concludes the end of the play. And like I say, I hope these videos have helped you. And there are questions on the play that we must answer. And like I said, just allow yourselves to think about the play as well. And that's the whole beauty of a play and pieces of artwork like that. It allows the reader or the viewer to actually think for themselves and not just be passive viewers or passive readers.